Every season for a while now, and I mean a while now, we have had to contend with many isekai anime coming out, most of which don't really leave an impression and are immediately forgotten upon the next season, and so on and so forth, rinse, wash, repeat. But of course, every so often you do get some isekai that generally do get a lot of buzz and hype, whether it's deserved or not. Some of this is because they have a really well-regarded, hyped-up source material, other times because they genuinely do something surprising and actually exceed expectations that many may have had for them. For me, this happened relatively recently in winter of this year with a little isekai known as The Wrong Way to Use Healing Magic. And I'll be completely honest, I did not have any expectations for this show when it was announced. I saw the name go around here and there. It sounded kind of dumb, which granted, to be fair, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at isekai anime, they do tend to have pretty weird and uninteresting names, and The Wrong Way to Use Healing Magic is certainly a different name compared to something like, me and my little sister got hit by a truck and were sent to a fantasy world where I am now her servant. So I will at least give it that it's a little bit different. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really a name that, for me personally, inspired a lot of confidence. But I ended up being very pleasantly surprised when I actually sat down and tried to watch the show. This is a series that actually has a lot of charm and a lot of positives to it, despite the fact that it is, for the most part, at the end of the day, doing a lot of the things you would expect an isekai to do. So why exactly did this one stand out when, by all accounts, it probably shouldn't have? Well, I think it comes down to a few reasons. One is pretty simply the characters. While they are not necessarily ones that are particularly deep, there is more to them than meets the eye, and more than you would expect from the types of isekai that have been coming out as of late. The dynamic amongst the main characters is fun. They play off each other very well, and the dynamics do kind of shift from what the show initially sort of sets you up to expect. It kind of plays into what you would think their dynamics would be and then sort of flips it on its head, primarily in the dynamic between Usato and Suzune, because Suzune ends up being a very different person from what Usato expects and what from the audience would expect, and their dynamic kind of does a 180, and it ends up being all the better for it because their bond and their interactions are very entertaining. You also have a character like Rose, who comes off initially as just this very strict, kind of mean, brutal instructor character, but actually ends up having a lot more going for her once we get into her backstory and learn exactly what her deal is and why she is this way, and why she treats Usato the way she does. And that in of itself doesn't necessarily make the characters groundbreaking or anything, but it gives them a lot more personality and a lot more intrigue than I ever would have expected from them. It also helps that while Usato does sort of end up becoming what you would expect of an isekai protagonist, this guy who seems unassuming but ends up having this really rare and crazy ability that ends up being pretty overpowered for him, the way it's utilized is different. He has healing magic, which is rare, and this means that he's not going to be some crazy overpowered fighter. He actually has to go through very difficult, very brutal training in order to build up his strength so that he can handle being a part of this rescue team to go into battle with the heroes and find people, potentially people who can't walk, haul them back to a med base and treat them. That does require strength, and he has to go through a lot to become strong enough to be able to handle that. And when the show actually gives us that big battle towards the end, we see him have to employ all the things that he had to train for. He didn't just start off being overpowered, he had to build up to it. He finds himself in situations where he has to use his healing magic, something that's not really meant to be offensive, and find a way to apply it in an offensive way. The titular wrong way to use that healing magic is actually pretty neat. And I respect the show for being able to take that and do it in a way that genuinely is like, wow, I would not have thought of that. The show exceeds the relatively low expectations I think most people would have had for it going into it. And that's not to say that I think you should expect the world from this show. It is still a fairly simple series and a fairly simple premise, but it has enough there to surprise you and keep you engaged that you're going to end up walking away from it feeling like you got more than you ever would have thought. The world itself also offers some potential for future intrigue, though. I want to emphasize future because we don't get a lot of the world building in this first season. The way the season ends does suggest that we are going to get some of that in season 2, which thankfully has already been announced. It wasn't when the show had ended, but now it since has. So I am looking forward to seeing where the show is going based on the direction it was in during the last couple episodes. And hopefully it continues to have more surprises, that the world has a lot more depth and a lot more intrigue than it initially lets on. Because basically that's what this show is. It's something that plays with your expectations and does more than you would ever have expected it to. Because it does initially present itself as this really generic, potentially forgettable isekai, but it's not. it's charming, and it does enough that even multiple months later, I still think about the show and think that was a really fun time. And I am looking forward to season 2. The only thing I, again, would caution is keep your expectations in check. I'm not saying go into this show expecting it to be bad, but don't expect it to be like the greatest thing ever. Because I'm not trying to say it's the greatest thing ever. I just think that it's a lot better than it has any right to be. And that is still something worth praising, especially when we're dealing with a genre like Isekai that has become very stale and repetitive and doesn't really like to do interesting things anymore. It's nice to see a show from that genre that does some unexpected things, that does leave a bit of an impression. So overall, I really did end up liking The Wrong Way to Use Healing Magic much more than I expected. And I think that if you passed on this show initially because it sounded pretty boring, which I do not blame you for whatsoever, give it a watch. I think you will be pleasantly surprised if you go in with the right expectations. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. And until next time, take care, everyone. Look forward to the next video.